Hello, everyone, and welcome to our workshop on community solutions to post-resettlement adaptation challenges, implications for policies and practices. My name is Dr. Sophie Yohani. I'm a professor of counseling psychology from the University of Alberta, and I'm with my dear colleagues here, Dr. Anna Kirova, professor of early childhood education, also from the Faculty of Education, University of Alberta, and Mr. Hassan Al-Ibrahim, community leader and multicultural and culture broker from the Multicultural Health Brokers Cooperative and member of the Syrian community here in Edmonton. We're grateful for the invitation to present this workshop for you today, and particular thanks to the co-chairs of the Pathways to Prosperity Partnership, Dr. Victoria Esses and Dr. Katie Crocker, and the team there at Western University. Thank you for the invitation today. So our project is part of a 5-year partnership between the University of Alberta, the Multicultural Health Brokers Cooperative, and members of the Syrian community in Edmonton, Alberta. And this has involved a series of projects focused on the psychosocial adaptation of Syrians. Our projects aim to generate knowledge of using community-based approaches to providing holistic support to Syrian individuals who arrived in Canada as refugees. Our overarching purpose has been to examine the psychosocial needs and adaptation processes amongst Syrian individuals and families using community learning for empowerment groups to build knowledge and identify solutions. So as a community-based research project, we are part of a very large team. We're only 3 members here, but as you can see here, we have a list of colleagues who are part of our research team, and they're made up of collaborators, co-investigators, community leaders, research assistants, and cultural brokers. So for our workshop today, we're going to provide you with a background and overview of our project, including the methodologies that we use for this particular project we're talking about today. And we're going to introduce you to our methodology, or one of the methods we use, called community learning for empowerment groups, and how we applied community-based participatory research principles to the use of these groups. Then we're going to talk about the implementation process, and ultimately we're going to share with you some of the solutions identified through these community learning for empowerment groups, in which we'll be calling CLEGs during this workshop. And then our community leader, Hassan, will talk specifically about the experiences of CLEGs in practice, including the strengths, challenges, and recommendations that emerged from the project. And we will end with some policy and practicing implications. We invite you to use the question and answer function that's available under your video. And you're welcome to submit questions throughout the presentation. And we will be responding to your questions during the last 15 minutes of the workshop. So please feel free to ask your questions throughout by using the chat, the question feature. So we are ready to start, and I'll pass over to my colleague, Anna.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for the introduction. And it is my pleasure to be part of this workshop today. It has been a very important project in my career and everybody else's career. It has taken us 5 years, but it is a response to the need for Syrian refugees who arrived in Canada in a short period of time and presented unique pressures to the systems, service providers, all levels of governments, and the communities in which they have settled. Since their arrival, resources have been directed towards meeting their immediate physical needs in such as housing, for example, and to some degree their acute mental health needs such as post-traumatic stress disorders. We believe, however, that although important, viewing mental health through the singular lens of post-traumatic stress disorder overlooks refugees' psychosocial needs, which also include safety, security, bonds, networks, roles and identities, justice, and existential needs. So we are convinced that a more holistic understanding of refugee trauma, migration, and adaptation experiences that includes all aspects of their psychosocial adaptation is critical. Our project, as you see on this slide, is guided by two theoretical frameworks that address holistically the integration and psychosocial adaptation that of refugees who have undergone mass violence and relocation. The first one is a social integration framework represented here by 10 gray circles. It has been developed by Eger and Strang in 2008. And what you see are these gray circles represent means and markers that are employment, housing, education, and health. And once we see refugees achieving these markers, then we can say that they have fully integrated in society. However, they are also means for integration. And the more education, the more housing, the more access to healthcare and employment refugees have, the better is the likelihood for refugees to integrate into society. I just want to point to a couple of other elements or domains, I forgot how we call them, domains of integration that are in the middle. These are community connectors. You see social bonds right in the middle. And also you see in the facilitators, you see safety and stability. I'm pointing out to these two because you see also emerging, from the bottom are the five pillars of psychosocial adaptation that are presented by Silove, and this is adaptation and development after persecution and trauma, or ADAPT model, that illustrates the psychosocial challenges, issues, and resources of individuals and community in post-conflict and resettlement settings after mass violence. So these five core domains that are in red on your screen are safety, security, need for networks or bonds, establish roles and identity, and having a sense of justice and existential meaning. These are the five universal, yet culturally and contextually dependent domains of psychosocial adaptation that are both the sites of trauma experiences and positive adaptation. This provides an understanding of how commonly experienced barriers to psychosocial adaptation are related to core psychosocial needs. What unites these two models is that the overlap of bonds and safety and security that are part of both models. And so they allow us to look holistically in the processes that other projects have not really integrated these models in the same way. So if we can now look at the methodologies that we use, you can see on this very busy slide, you see that as Dr. Yuhani already mentioned, it's a 5-year partnership between the University of Alberta and Multicultural Health Brokers Cooperative, as well as members of Syrian community in Edmonton, Alberta. While the objectives and the research questions are numerous, and I'm not going to read them to you, the overall aim for this project was to generate knowledge about benefits of using community-based approach to providing holistic support to Syrian individuals who arrived in Canada as refugees. Its overall purpose was to examine the psychosocial needs and adaptation processes among Syrian individuals and families by using community learning for empowerment groups to build knowledge, to identify community-based solutions, and to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in the research process. Just to point your attention, as the workshop title indicates, we're going to focus on the question that is the last on the list of questions. There are 4 major research questions, but this presentation will focus on community-identified solutions and how they affect different groups and their integration pathways. So in order to address these questions and to achieve our objectives, we used community-based participatory approach to research, including ethnographic data collection, methods using CLEGs and also focus groups and thematic analysis to interpret the data over 3 phases of implementation. Consistent with the principles of community-based study, Syrian community leaders and bicultural community brokers were involved in all phases in activities. During phase 1, 7 community leaders were trained to facilitate CLEGs using the ADAPT model. And following the training, members of the research team engage in collaborative process of co-creating a CLEG facilitation guide. And we will talk a little more in depth later on in the presentation. So I'm just going to skip now to phase 2, which included CLEGs being facilitated by the 7 trained community leaders and the 3 bicultural brokers. There were 7 groups, each consisting of 6 to 8 participants. We had a total of 62 participants who represented diverse ages, gender, ethnicities, including different groups such as seniors and men, women, and Kurdish individuals who are a minority within the Syrian society in general and the Syrian community in Edmonton. We will talk about the Syrian community and its diversity a little later on. CLEGs use the learning cycle format where participants were invited to reflect on their individual and shared experiences, and research assistants and academic members attended and observed most groups in their functions. Focus groups following the CLEGs discussions on each of the psychosocial domains were also held in phase 2, and there were 8 focus groups that were held during phase 2 of the project. Currently, we're in the phase 3 of the project that involves analyzing data, and that was collected from both the CLEGs discussions and the focus groups, and knowledge translation. We are in the process of developing a community empowerment resources based on the findings from this study and working with our community partners to mobilize knowledge. We just held our community information sharing event that included community members, the leaders themselves, as well as other stakeholders such as policymakers, at municipal and provincial levels, and we're very proud of how this evolved with part of this dissemination efforts on our part. So obviously, community learning for empowerment groups is one key element of our project, and obviously also a key construct in that is empowerment. So we used Rappaport definition of empowerment, and we understood this to be a process or a mechanism by which people, organizations, and communities gain mastery over their own lives. And so we believe strongly that the members should have and do have a fundamental role in the transformation process, which of course Freire first established. The application of community-based participatory research facilitated an equitable partnership with guidelines for an empowering and power-sharing process while attending to social inequalities. And this power-sharing process will become a bit more apparent to you as we talk about different stages more in depth. So CLEGs are basically qualitative data collection methods within the frames of the study, where participants contribute their unique strengths, skills, resources, and shared responsibility to enhance an understanding of a given phenomenon and the social and cultural dynamics of the community. CLEGs pair well with the community-based participatory research as they make it possible to integrate knowledge, and in our particular case, knowledge of the ADAPT framework in psychosocial adaptation with action, that improves the health and well-being of the community members. In our particular case, that is the Syrian community. Central to our work of establishing and helping the leaders run these groups was Friere's approach, critical pedagogical approach to dialogue in creating dialogical spaces in which persons are acted with rather than on as a way of freeing people from cultures of silence. We believe that following Freire, we believe that transformative dialogue occurs when all engaged have mutual humility, love, faith, and trust. And while they're engaged, also critical thinking. And I have to share with you that our sharing event with the Syrian community showed the love and the faith and the trust in one another. It was heartwarming to see that after 5 years, we have actually become one with the community. So community-based participatory research methods facilitated co-learning and capacity building among all partners. And this is possible and was possible in cross-cultural research context only because of the essential role that cultural brokers played in the empowerment and also in the sharing, creating the shared dialogical space in CLEGS. So cultural brokers, as we already mentioned, are essential part of our project. They are members of a particular ethnic community that participates in the study. In this case, the Syrian and Kurdish community that are responsible for bringing, bridging, linking, or mediating between groups or persons of different cultural backgrounds to bring about change and reduce conflict. This is a definition that Dr. Yuhani provided for us in her publication of 2019. In our study, working with cultural brokers was essential because Syrians are a diverse group and include people who are not from Syrian background. And in our participant group, this was a subset of Kurdish participants. So why are cultural brokers important? Because they bridge, they liaise, they help provide context for leaders to understand research processes and the researchers to understand cultural and contextual details. They also ensure that interest and well-being of the community members are always at the front of the research activities. They are essential part of all phases of the study, including formulating the research questions, training, CLEG implementation, analysis, feedback on the meetings, focus groups, and knowledge mobilization activities. Also, early on in the project, they made sure that any perceived or real miscommunications or tensions between the research team and the community members, as well as among the community members themselves, are resolved, and we have a space to discuss them and move on as a group. So their role is essential. And one absolutely key role that they play is translating and interpreting throughout the entire project, because as researchers, we are not bi or trilingual, even though we speak different languages, but Arabic is not, or Kurdish is not one of them. So understanding the language of the participants and translating between, making sure that there are no miscommunications was absolutely crucial to the success of this project. So in terms of how CBPR principles are applied through the use of CLEGS, we are very clear that at the end of the project that as a data collection method, CLEGS facilitate a co-created community empowerment model of support through co-learning and capacity building among all participants, establishing a balance between research and action for the mutual benefit of all partners, through understanding problems of local relevance and ecological perspectives that recognize and attend to the multiple determinants of health and well-being, and through building on strengths and resources within the community. As already mentioned, our project involved 3 phases, and each phase reflected the principles of CBPR and relational ethics based on our model, based on Freire approach to dialogue in dialogical spaces. So relational ethics was important to our project as well. In phase 1, the focus on training and team development fostered a strong partnership between the research team, community leaders, and community workers. Co-creating the CLEG facilitation guide as part of this phase promoted co-learning and shared decision-making among all members. The guide that we produced collaboratively was made up of 6 modules that included an introductory module and 1 for each of the 5 ADAPT model core psychosocial domains: safety, identity, attachment, bonds, justice, and meaning. And these domains were used as broad topics for initiating group discussions in CLEGs. In phase 2, Syrian community members and leaders who were trained in phase 1 facilitated the CLEGs, allowing for the shift in power from the research team to the members of the community. The focus of the CLEGs on supporting psychosocial adaptation of community members created an environment of social change for community members, resulting in mutual benefits for academic members and research team members and the members of Syrian community who participated in CLEGs. After each CLEG module, focus groups were held with leaders and cultural brokers and research team to review learnings from each other's groups and from the facilitation process. Syrian community leaders and cultural brokers and academic members of the research team participated in the focus groups to debrief and reflect on the experiences and learning that had emerged from the CLEGs. The focus groups also provided the opportunity for the leaders and cultural brokers to share their feedback on the CLEGs and shape their future implementation. Therefore, from our perspective, the focus groups created the opportunity for leaders to shape the design and the implementation of the CLEGs. And we talked about the Syrian community and how diverse it is, but we haven't really told you who participated in our CLEGs. And so we, as you see on this slide, and I'm sure many of you are aware of how diverse Syrian society is, the number of languages spoken, the number of different minority ethnic groups, the different religions represented in the society. So with this vast variety of different individuals in all the combination of these markers of identity, it is impossible to have a study that represents this diversity in society. But we do have some diversity within our own group. We had, out of the 7 community leaders in this project, 2 identified as Kurdish and 1 as a Christian. As a Christian. In our groups, we had 1 women group, 1 senior group, 1 youth, and 4 mixed groups with participants of different ages. We also had participants from urban areas of Syria and rural areas of Syria. And the makeup of the groups, we had 48.7% male and 51.3% female participants in the study. And as I said, we don't see that as a representative of the Syrian society in general, but also helps us see the groups that we have missed. And so I'm sure that Dr. Yuhani will talk about this in her part of the presentation, what is next for us as a research project, which groups we would actively try to recruit in order for us to have more full representation and idea how Syrian community members have in fact settled in and what kind of experience they had in Canada. So with this, I'm passing on to Dr. Yohani. Thank you for changing the slides for me.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kirova. So now I'm going to share with you sort of a little bit of what this actually looked like. Dr. Kirova set the context, the background, sort of the methodology. And so hopefully here we'll give you some examples to kind of bring this to life. So during phase one, as we mentioned, we focus on team development and leader training, and as well as the co-creation of the facilitation guide for the CLEGs that we use to generate solutions. And our project utilized a train-the-trainer approach in this first phase, whereby the community leaders who worked with us were trained to facilitate CLEGs using the ADAPT framework. So recall, the ADAPT framework is one of the combined frameworks that we use as the basis for the project. And this is the one that focuses on psychosocial adaptation in the aftermath of mass violence and relocation. During this phase, our leaders also participated in training meetings with the rest of the research team on topics of community-based participatory research, data collection methods, group facilitation, and specifically on the 4 core domains of the ADAPT model. As well, all members of our team were introduced to trauma-informed practices as a basis for working with Syrians, and also it is also a foundation of the ADAPT model. We drew on Freire's notions of empowerment and dialogical space, as described by Dr. Kirova, to foster this learning environment where leaders, culture brokers, academic team members, we all reflected on these theories and reflected on these concepts to our own experiences. So following the training, the team began the process of co-creating the CLEGs and the facilitation guide. And this involved taking each of the domains of the ADAPT conceptual framework and engaging in a dialogue beginning with the development of a shared understanding and language for each of the specific domains. Also, central to CBPR and Freire's philosophy of education is that recognition of tacit knowledge, including insights, perspectives, and wisdoms that are drawn from lived experience as legitimate forms of knowledge and imported in the co-creation of this guide that we were going to use for the CLEGs. So for example, stories were added to the facilitation guide in response to our leaders' feedback on the cultural value of storytelling. So at the end of the process, we had incorporated elements that were relevant to the cultural context and language for the Syrian community members. So here's an example of some of the work that we were doing during this phase. So when discussing safety, so in the ADAPT model, as you remember, there are 5 domains that we tend to look at: safety, attachment bonds, identity, justice, and sense of meaning. When discussing safety, the Arabic-speaking members determined that they would use al-aman as a shared word for the project. This shared meaning making was a critical component of all of the modules in the CLEG development phase. As you know, the meaning of words is related to history and experiences of those who use words. And what we noted also were there were some slight differences in how identity was experienced by Kurds as well as Assyrian members of our project. So again, through dialogue, they agreed on the word al-hawiya to refer to identity when moving into the group discussions. And also during this phase, leaders reflected on the 5 discussion questions that we use on the right here. As you can see, we've adapted them from Smith and colleagues' 1997 approach to community-based participatory work and the questions that they had come up with. And again, these were questions that we used, but also as we moved into the second phase of the project, we were open to feedback also from the community members as they engage in dialogue to adjust some of the questions. So during phase 2, each of the community learning for empowerment groups led by a leader and a culture broker used one of the domains of the ADAPT model as a focal topic to enter into conversations regarding challenges, regarding strengths and solutions during those early years of adaptation in Canada. And the meetings tend to be about 3 hours long with a break for lunch or afternoon tea provided by Syrian community caterers. And I just want to point out here that this integration of social time around food became an important aspect of our project. During these breaks, community members could relax and recompose after what at times were difficult conversations. These breaks also provided community members and the research team members an opportunity to interact casually, which also helped with supporting relationship development and trust building over time. And community members were supported to attend CLEGs through provision of childcare, as well as refunding transportation costs. So these were also important contexts within these groups for the discussions that were taking place that I want to point out. After each of the modules, as Dr. Kirova had mentioned, leaders and team members would meet through focus groups to reflect on the learnings from each of the groups, from the facilitation process and overall supports that might be needed for leaders. These conversations were critical as we worked to address and adjust to project processes and content to the realities of the community we were working with at that time. So as an example, again, some of the changes that took place were adapting discussion questions and order in some of the actual modules. So here you can see that we adapted some of the discussion questions within the identity module based on our leaders' input. So rather than following the adaptation of Smith's method that we used, we actually switched to another method based on our leaders. For example, what the leaders noticed and the feedback that we saw from the leaders was that group members naturally organize their stories and discussions into strengths, challenges, and solutions. And so we reorganized our questions to match that language as well as the flow within our discussions, as you can see here. Okay. And then in phase 3, when we proceeded to phase 3, this was when COVID-19, the pandemic actually hit us. And these, of course, it had a strong impact on our own lives as well as the everyday lives of the community members we were working with. And so what we did at that time was we conducted some additional interviews with some of our participants to understand the impact of the pandemic on Syrian newcomer community, because they were still adjusting still within the early years of the pandemic when within the early years of adaptation when the pandemic hit. We then analyzed all of the group discussions thematically with the assistance of in vivo software. And then on a separate analysis, we focused on the psychosocial adaptation solutions that were generated in each of the discussion groups that happened across all 7 groups. So as you can imagine, we did have quite a large number of solutions that were being generated from the different groups. And we worked closely with the 7 leaders to analyze, and then they prioritized the solutions according to the order of importance that they felt will be critical to address. And these were then presented to the community in an online forum, and we obtained some feedback at that point. As Dr. Kirova had mentioned, more recently, we have engaged in a number of mobilizing activities, knowledge mobilizing activities, including a large stakeholder and community forum on February 24th, in which we have over 70 members of people in attendance who included people from the settlement sector, City of Edmonton, provincial government, academia, and members of the Syrian community, as well as a few other refugee communities. And the idea here was to begin to kind of examine those solutions that were generated and begin to look at what would be the policy implications or practice implications of the solutions that were generated. There's 7 areas or themes around solutions that have come up from the project. So let me share some of the highlighted ones that were prioritized by leaders in our analysis with them. So these can be divided to solutions that would be critical to address within the Syrian community, solutions that could be addressed at government level, and then solutions for community organizations. So there are many. I just want to kind of preface this that there are many solutions that were generated. I'm just going to highlight a few of the ones that were prioritized through a process of sorting by our community leaders in the project. Form a unified Syrian entity to maintain and share Syrian culture, advocate, learn about Canadian systems, and support newcomers. So this was one of the recommendations. Create a spaces for dialogue and sharing emotions, stories, and experiences. And this comes out of the evaluation that we did at the end of our CLEGs, at the end of all the modules that we completed in the groups, we did provide an evaluation. And what came out quite strongly there in terms of the feedback from the community members who participated in CLEGs was the importance of having the opportunity to meet fairly early on in their resettlement process in Canada, to sit and reflect on the experiences, to talk about the challenges, but also to focus on strengths and to share those stories about the experiences. So that social connection time was critical. And so the spaces for dialogue and sharing emotion, stories, and experiences come out of this, but also where solutions were generated in this process as well. Some of the recommendations for government were support newcomer employment by recognizing foreign earned credentials and experience and creating connections to supportive employers. So recall that our study, while it might be generating some elements that seem familiar in the context of the usual kind of concerns that newcomers have in Canada, this is happening in the context of conversations around psychosocial adjustment, adaptation. And so what members are saying here, that having connection to supportive employers were also in response to concerns with safety and also experiences of injustice, and the importance of having those facilitated connections to supportive employers, but also that this was linked to experiences of injustice or perceptions of injustice. Facilitate family reunification by easing requirements, improving navigation and convenience of the sponsorship process, and providing more direct support to newcomer sponsors. This was very much linked to experiences and concerns with threats and severances of attachment systems from a psychosocial perspective, and how safety and security for many of the members were actually linked to sense of to their family, and the sense that when my family, I'm secure with my family. If I have my family, it really helps to enhance my sense of safety psychologically, even though I might be physically more safer in Canada. For service providing organization, there were many recommendations that we hope to continue to share as these results emerge from our project, but there were some unique kind of concerns around English language learning for mothers and women with children. And so there was some specific recommendation around exploring creative ways to actually help women who have large numbers of children who may not have access to regular language classes because of the challenges with space for childcare provision that are within those organizations. There was recommendations for prioritizing access to mental health and social supports. There was recommendations for supporting entrepreneurship within newcomer communities. and prioritizing an understanding of youth's unique experiences and developmental needs and addressing their immediate, urgent, and long-term needs. One of the groups within the project was with youth. And so we have some very specific kind of findings that come out of the experiences of youth in the context of this larger project. So those are some of the solutions that were generated through the use of CLEGs, and then later prioritized by our leaders within the project. And Hassan, now our community leader and member of the Syrian community, is going to share a little bit more specifically his own experiences as he come through. So Mr. Al-Ibrahim, I'll pass it over to you now. Oops, I'm going to come back to that.
Thank you very much, Professor Youhani and Professor Kirova. That's my, I'm proud to be here and share my special experience about, this specific, project, which I was part of it. My pride come from being part of the Syrian society and Syrian community in Edmonton and working on this project with over 6 years. This journey has not been easy and does not involve many challenges. I speak from myself when I participated in this project with the University of Alberta, with MCHP and Professor Ifan and Professor Youhani and Professor Kirova. We discussed the, my participation will focus on the solution of my groups has presented. I want to speak about myself first and how this project helped me understand my capabilities and options. Many notions about resettlement in Canada were hidden and changing to come by. Through this project, I learned to rediscover myself. I walked this journey of, about my own strength and weakness and how to be a better person. From a refugee in 2017 in the, the last project, who could not even speak a word of English to the youth counselor. I work with MCHP organization. I work in field of information technology, IT. My achievements are many, and of course they came because of focusing on myself and getting the benefit of this project, understanding the system in Canada and defining the 5 points that Professor Ifan mentioned and Professor Kirova about the methodology. My latest, achievement in this, I'm finished, my PhD in economic assistance in writing a book. I just will share some of that book too, about, a group of 13 of my many groups who participate in this book and participate in, adapting model project. Assistance in collecting information for more than 10 university theses discussing the issue of the immigrations and psychological and social diminishing. I just will say it quickly in Arabic, if you allow me to do that. أشعر بالفخر لكوني أنتمي إلى المجتمع السوري والذي عملنا معا مدة 6 سنوات متواصلة على هذا المشروع. لم تكن هذه الرحلة سهلة ولا تنطوي على الكثير من التحديات. أتكلم عن نفسي عندما تطوعت للمشاركة في هذا المشروع مع جامعة ألبرتا ومع دكتور يوهاني ودكتور كيروفا. أتحدث عن آلية المشروع وأتمنى أن تكون مشاركتي عن الحلول التي قدمتها مجموعتي. أتحدث عن نفسي أولا كيف أن هذا المشروع ساعدني في فهم إمكانياتي وخياراتي. كانت الكثير من المفاهيم حول إعادة التوطين في كندا خفية ويصعب الحصول عليها. من خلال مشاركتي لهذا البرنامج تعرفت عليها وشاركت هذه المعلومات مع مجتمعي في إدمنتون. عرفت نقاط القوة ونقاط الضعف التي أمتلكها وكيف العمل عليها. أتيت كلاجئ في 2017 يعني لا أتقن اللغة الإنجليزية إلى مستشار شبابي الآن أعمل مع MCHP وأعمل في مجال تقنيات المعلومات. إنجازاتي بفضل الله تعالى كثيرة وطبعا أتت كنتيجة للعمل على نفسي وفهم النظام في كندا. تحديد النقاط الخمسة التي تحدث عنها بروفيسور يوهاني. وآخر إنجازاتي يعني المساعدة في تأليف كتاب عن الهجرة لأكثر من 15 لاجئ شاركوا معي بالمجموعة. المساعدة في جمع المعلومات لأكثر من 10 رسائل جامعية تناقش مسألة اللجوء والهجرة والأبعاد النفسية والاجتماعية. As a result of the war that took place in Syria, thousands of the Syrians suffered, not just in the Syria, but also when they moved out of the border and neighbors countries. And even here in Canada, there was some difficulties adapting to these new countries. In my community and my community in Edmonton, I met with a group of men for the Syrian community in Edmonton to manage discussions. In the dialogue sessions, everyone was able to recall memories and discuss issue in the safe environment. Despite all the challenges and circumstances they faced, my community was determined to achieve their goals and move forward in the life despite all the challenges they faced. For example, there was a wrong understanding of maintaining their identity, especially for their children, and worry about their children. Many of the group felt fear for their future here in Canada, especially since there are significant concern about adhering to identity. This solved many of their identities after a few years. Through the intensive course we did and the knowledge that I transferred and shared it with my community, we discovered that maintaining identity is one of the fundamentals things of living here in Canada. However, most schools and government programs encourage the preserving of the identity and have a special program to help people maintain their cultural identities. There are many things that have been achieved after this research and after this project, when I just working with my main group, which have benefit community members, but many still need to review and search again for solution, which we come out with many solutions, as Professor Yohani and Professor Krova mentioned about that. Positive change and finding a safe space for newcomers and refugees. Many of communities live in refugees campus and were exposed to difficulty circumstances. However, they still have believe in their capabilities to complete their journey and provide their children with a safe environment. If you lose something dear to you, you will spend a lot of time thinking about it. What about the Syrian who, they lost their life, their relatives, their lands, their cars, their homes, their parents and mothers? However, they still love life and want to achieve to be active members of the society of Canada. It is a message for every community that suffered from the effective of trauma and disasters. Yes, we can overcome difficulties times, and this Syrian society which live in Edmonton is most impressive example for that. I just wanted to say that again to, if I have time, yes. نسبة إلى الحرب التي وقعت في سوريا، عانى الكثير من السوريين الصدمات التي تلت الحرب. المعاناة لم تكن فقط في سوريا ولكن أيضا في البلاد الحدودية التي انتقلوا إليها، وحتى هنا في كندا كان هنالك بعض المعاناة في التكيف في هذه البلاد الجديدة. كانت مهمتي في إدارة المناقشات والبحث عميقا في مجتمعي، والذي كنت ألتقي بمجموعة من المشاركين من الجالية السورية في إدمنتون. كانت الجلسات الحوارية عبارة عن مكان آمن يجلس الجميع فيه ويبدأ استرجاع الذكريات والمناقشات. اكتشفت كم هي جاليتي قوية وتستطيع أن تكون إيجابية ومساهمة في بناء أنفسها، في بناء نفسها من جديد رغم كل التحديات التي كانت تواجهها والظروف التي كانت تمر بها، ولكن كانت مصممة على تحقيق الأهداف. على سبيل المثال، كان هنالك فهم خاطئ بالمحافظة على الهوية، وكان يشعر الكثير من مجموعتي بالخوف على مستقبلهم هنا في كندا، وخاصة أن كانت هنالك مخاوف كبيرة حول التمسك بالهوية، وأن الكثير كانت هوياتهم تذوب بعد بضع السنين. من خلال الدورة المكثفة التي قمنا بها والمعرفة التي نقلتها إلى مجتمعي، اكتشفنا أن المحافظة على الهوية من أساسيات العيش هنا في كندا، بل أن الكثير من المدارس والبرامج الحكومية التي تشجع على المحافظة على الهوية، وعندها برامج خاصة لمساعدة الناس في المحافظة على هوياتهم الثقافية. هنالك الكثير من الأمور التي تحققت بعد، وهنالك من الأمور التي لا بد أن تتحقق في المستقبل. استفاد منها أبناء مجتمعي، لكن هنالك الكثير من الأشياء التي تحتاج إلى إعادة النظر والبحث مجددا حول حلول يمكن أن تساهم في التغيير الإيجابي وإيجاد مساحات آمنة للقادمين الجدد واللاجئين. الكثير من مجتمعي عانى من مخيمات اللجوء وتعرض لظروف صعبة، إلا أنهم ما زال عندهم إيمان بقدراتهم وأبنائهم لنكمل مشوارنا ولنوفر لهم الأجواء الآمنة ونستوعبهم. إذا فقدت شيئا عزيزا على قلبك سوف تقضي الكثير من الوقت في التفكير فيه، وكيف أن ملايين السوريين فقدوا أموالهم وأقاربهم وأراضيهم وسياراتهم وبيوتهم وآبائهم وأمهاتهم، وما زالوا يحبون الحياة ويريدون أن يكون عناصر فعالة في المجتمع. هي رسالة لكل جالية تعاني من آثار اللجوء والحرب والكوارث. نعم، نستطيع أن نتجاوز الأوقات الصعبة، وهذا المجتمع السوري الذي يعيش في إدمنتون أكبر مثال على ذلك. لنفتح الأبواب أمام طاقاتنا ونسهم في خدمة مجتمعنا. وفي النهاية لا يسعني إلا أن أشكر الجميع. I just wanted to share, this is the book I just helped with establish it about my group, main group, who participate with Professor Yohani and Professor Kirova. It's, around 120 pages about their stories and their challenges, their experience here in Canada, and how the project helped them. I just want to read, a part of one of my, group members. His name Khalid. He said, Khalid thinks about Syria often. One of his brothers still live in Damascus. He has a disability and cannot work. Khalid sends him some money every month. He tells us that many people in Syria are currently living without electricity, food, heat, and money. People are still afraid of these authorities. I like having a new life here, but at the same time, I believe my past life was also beautiful. Sometimes I want to return to Damascus in Syria. I spent 50 years on my life in Damascus, and it's very hard to leave it. This is one of my, main group who participate with me. He shared with me, lastly, I just want to speak about the solution, which my community come out with it. We, as you see, we just, this is the idea of Professor Yohani and Professor Kirova, who make it as a visual attraction to the people who will use it. Now lastly, what happened in the in Afghanistan and in other countries who face the war, and and just and Ukrainian who came to Edmonton and came to Canada, highly recommended to work with them and use this a special procedure and a special program adapting model to help them from the first year in Canada, and they will come out with many solutions. And I think mostly who live in the campus and refugees campus, suffering from less of food, less of care, health care, they face the same struggling experience. With this project, there are a lot of solution that will help to understand the experience of disasters and the war. Thank you very much, Professor Ifan, and thank you, Professor Kirova, and everyone to have me today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. El Ibrahim, and for giving us an in-depth kind of perspective, and I appreciate that you shared with both languages, so our audience members, especially those who are Arabic speaking, can hear it from their own language as well. So to conclude our workshop, I wanted to sort of tie together some of the policy and practice implications that that kind of were synthesized actually more recently from our community and stakeholder forum that we had recently, as we've mentioned earlier. And that these were sort of some of the, from the conversations we had over the course of the day, that really stood out as critical for us to sort of bring forward, and even in this context with you. So here, some of the things that came out in terms of policy and practical implications are, could we begin to look at how how we provide settlement supports through our settlement organizations, that could we look at restructuring and reorganizing those supports to include a psychosocial focus in resettlement rather than the current exclusive focus on language learning and housing. That psychosocial factors are critical as well. And they actually, as you saw through the model that we presented earlier, but also evidence through our research conversations, our findings, that, that they do permeate and they do link to experiences with housing, with employment, with education and healthcare. But by looking specifically at some of the links between that and people's sense of safety, a sense of what gives them a sense of justice, what's important for identity and roles in the new context, as well as their attachments and bonds to each other and within the new society. There was also a recommendation that we focus on mental health prevention rather than exclusively on reactive interventions or crisis interventions, that a prevention model, actually a universal prevention model, would be really important, because in some ways everybody has been affected, perhaps in different ways, but having that early opportunities for just addressing their concerns, bringing people together in a social context that is safe to share and talk about their experiences can be also really important. There was also a recommendation to include programming for underserved refugee groups. As Mr. Al Ibrahim had shared, that he ran a group with men. And what came strongly out of that, and including in our forum recently, was that there aren't enough spaces for refugee men, male identifying refugees, to meet and have conversations about their specific needs and concerns. And so that came up. Also, members of the LGBTQ plus community, was a re-emphasis on the importance of having that. We didn't have a group specifically for members of this community. We had people who were kind of interspersed, but it wasn't at that point set up and in a way that was for this particular project, but that did come out as an important to actually have spaces for members of LGBTQ refugee groups. As Mr. Al Ibrahim just shared with the example of Khalid and his through the story that he just shared right now, throughout the project, as well as at our recent forum, a focus on family reunification with recently resettled refugees was a strong recommendation that came out of this project, as well as addressing barriers to accessing language learning for women and seniors. And so as I mentioned earlier, women with children, but also seniors in our project talked about some of the challenges that they had with access to language learning, and particularly during the pandemic, as many of the members of our project testified that they lost their language because of course not being able to access language classes. But specifically during the project, we were invited to explore innovative approaches to address space and childcare giver ratio challenges faced by organizations where women who have large numbers of children are finding those as barriers to accessing language classes. So for example, this came out as a recommendation of a solution from our senior groups, that involving community seniors in child support to ease burdens on organizations could also facilitate first language development, as also provide a culturally relevant caregiver relationship, both for seniors and children's, as an innovative approach to addressing some of these barriers, but also meeting community needs. Also, one recommendation was provide English language classes that are culturally relevant to seniors by enlisting bicultural English language teachers to provide classes in community settings. And this actually did come out during our project, where the seniors group raised this as a concern, and they were able to actually have somebody from within the community who was bicultural and bilingual English language teacher start lessons with the senior group within our project. There was a recommendation to support access to entrepreneurship opportunities for newcomers, and also that volunteerism, supporting volunteer within organizations that link to the work that they have been doing prior to resettlement would be one avenue for addressing some of the employment barriers that they faced. And over again, concerns with children's mental health emerge in the project. And so prioritize mental health and psychosocial supports for all refugee children and youth using a school-based prevention model could be one, is a strong recommendation from our project. And finally, the use of community learning for empowerment groups could be a community level mechanism for supporting safe dialogical spaces for reflecting on people's trauma experiences, but also addressing community needs, as well as Mr. El Ibrahim just mentioned right now here, that having these spaces such as those in CLEGS can help with co-generation of solutions, as well as co-implementation of solutions between community groups, but also within local municipal government and other sectors that can work alongside refugee communities during early years of resettlement. And so this brings us to the end of our presentation. And I'd like to end with just a short video that one of our research team members developed during the project that will summarize again for you. I know it's been a long hour going through what was a long project, but I'd like to end with a video just to kind of summarize what we've shared with you.
I grew up in the old alleys of Policie and was born in one of the city's oldest hospitals. My typical morning back in Syria would start with the sound of the morning call to prayer coming from the neighborhood mosque, followed by the sound of birds as the sun starts rising. In 2011, all these memories were reshaped beyond recognition by the destruction of war and mass displacement. In less than 1 year, neighborhoods no longer looked the same, and neighbors were either killed or left their houses for the wind.
أنا اسمي جود نور الدين وأنا طالبة لاجئة.
This is how I introduced myself in Canada, where I arrived with thousands of other Syrian refugees fleeing war and persecution. It has been more than 40 years since Canada started welcoming Syrian refugees, and many questions regarding the adaptation of Syrian refugees are rising. Questions like, how are Syrians doing? How are they adapting? What strengths have they brought that help them adapt? And how can we better help them adapt to their new communities? As a research assistant on a SHREC-funded project at the University of Alberta, I got involved in a study that seeks to answer these questions by understanding the psychosocial adaptation and integration of Syrian refugees using community learning empowerment groups. In this community-based participatory research study, 7 leaders from the Syrian community were trained to run groups of Syrian men, women, youth, and seniors from different ethnicities and backgrounds. The groups focused on main psychosocial domains impacted by trauma and mass violence as entry points into conversations that were set up in a manner that was safe and supportive. By running these groups, we are learning whether this group format is a useful model for community-based initiatives to support community development and address mental health issues. Syrian refugees are given a familiar space where they can meet and discuss topics that are very specific to their lives within the first years of arrival. We are building the capacity among national leaders of the Syrian communities to organize and run similar groups in the future. Syrian men, women, youth, and seniors are provided a place where they can voice their experiences and recommendations to what can support their psychosocial adaptation. Some groups have started mobilizing themselves to find solutions to some of the challenges they have identified. For example, the seniors group has established their own English class addressing the language barrier. Starting a new home away from home for refugees is never easy, but having more community-based research like this one helps them believe that it is possible.
And that brings us to the end of our workshop presentation component. And thank you for listening and being with us during the last hour. And I'm going to read some questions that have come up here. And here, we're going to begin. So the first question I have here is, in one of the initial slides, two of the domains you mentioned were social bridges and social bonds. How are these domains different? Fantastic question, something that we've talked a lot about in the project, and I will invite actually, Anna, would you like to respond to that one?
Absolutely, thank you very much. I'm sorry I didn't have enough time to go over the model is very comprehensive. Basically, the difference between social bonding at a community level is that newcomers first at arrival, if there are any other members of the ethnic cultural community that they belong to, they're likely to start establishing these bonding relationships within their ethnic community. With time, it's likely that these bonds, when they become strong and people feel safe and secure within these ethnic-like communities, they are likely to bridge out. So these are the bridging activities. So they bridge out to different communities. For example, faith, going to the mosque, for example, in our case with Syrian refugees. It doesn't mean that everybody who attends the mosque is from the Syrian community. So they're bridging out to different communities that share faith, but also come from different ethnic background. Another example with the mainstream society is when through school, for example, parents have their children enrolled in extracurricular activities. So in soccer clubs, they are likely to meet other groups, other parents who are not from the ethnic community. So these bridging relationships begin to evolve as ethnocultural community members are settled and also have time to bridge out. So that's the difference between the bonding, that is the ethnic-like community, and the bridging is to community that are not from the same ethnocultural background. And this over time, and research has shown actually that with stronger community bonds, people are likely to bridge out faster and better. If they don't feel secure in their own community bonding, they're less likely to bridge out to other communities. So that is the difference, and I hope that I answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kirova. The second question that I see here is, thank you for the presentation and for Hassan for sharing your experience. To Anna and Sophia, I'm wondering about the concept of empowerment. Syrian refugees may define empowerment differently. Did you have a chance to ask them how they understand empowerment? That's a fantastic question, and one that we kind of struggled quite a bit with in terms of how to just not kind of give a particular perspective. And as you saw from I'll answer this and then I'll let Anna as well as Hassan join. But we chose to begin the conversations, for example, during our training or the first phase of the project, where we looked at empowerment as a process. So rather than it being just an outcome that you're empowered, that it's just a process by which people, organizations, and communities begin to gain some mastery over their lives. And so this is how we introduced empowerment in this context, rather than that we are reaching sort of an end goal that one is going to be empowered and that's a static process. So we didn't really want to kind of make that a specific goal in the end that everyone has to be empowered, but that it's a process of being given space to speak, to share your experiences, to provide your recommendations in the context of a group setting, that you would have a voice to contribute to in the context of your community. So that's how we introduce this and reflected on within the groups and within the training. I'm going to ask, I think Hassan, maybe I think he's in the best position to see how he and how his group members looked at this idea of feeling empowered and what this meant for them. So I'm going to ask Hassan if you would like to share.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much. I just want to remember the process of the program. When we just empower the leader and the educator first and give them the kind of the information and the psychological information about how the brain functions. And when we just meet our groups, we have these skills to deal with them and to tell them about that. It's very simple when you just try to, some people, they just, when they come to Canada, they feel it's very heavy to moving because they don't have, access to the system. They have some, as a trauma, PTSD experience. But when we just, let them know, express their self and how they can, we want to just to share the responsibility with them. We told them, yes, you get some part of the responsibility to help your community to be strong again. Yeah, kind of that. When we just mention about this information and teach ourselves and teach them about how the body it's working and the brain is working, the good things when they just take this information and they start to share about their stories and what happened in Syria in that kind of time, and they come, when they come here, a lot of ideas and the trauma experience, it's put a weight on them. But when they understand the system, and yes, I can be proud of myself, I can remain my identity in Canada, I can be in touch with others, groups and the families, attachment, bonds, point. Yes, when we just teach them about that and we let them know exactly you have that's right, and you have that power to empower yourself and empower your family and the society. They feel very happy, and they as I told you, they remember how they, working in the small groups in Syria, and the social groups in Syria.
Thank you. Dr. Kirova, would you like to add to what myself and Mr. El Ibrahim have added here?
I think that we have 2 more questions. I think that you covered the topic quite well. Thank you. But we have 2 more questions if we have time to address those.
Okay. So thank you. So we have another question here. The concept of unified Syrian entity is interesting. How did this unified entity align with the diversities within Syrian refugees? So I believe this attendee is asking a question that came up as a recommendation, that it would be nice if the community had a unified kind of organization or entity as a recommendation that came out of the project. Again, I think I will ask Mr. El Ibrahim if he would like to respond to that.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, exactly. That's the idea. Yani, we start this experience in Edmonton and this project in Edmonton, and we share these ideas on the Facebook and the social media, and we would like to all the Syrian in Canada, they participate in in this kind of project. And and we still, as Professor Yohani said, that we still under we working in this project, and we have a lot of ideas to futures. I just wanted to add something is very important. When we as a group of researcher and researcher work team, we give a promise to share this with the decision makers, those solution, and that's make all the Syrian happy when when they have a recommendation about solution, and the solution it's come out to life again, and to help them to go through their their difficulties. I think that's very important things to empower Syrian, or I wanted to say Canadian Syrian who faced this kind of trauma in Syria and the war, and give them opportunity to write their solution and write their future history.
Thank you very much. And they did come out through many of the groups that there was a desire for some kind of unified organization or some kind of umbrella organization. And the challenge was, how do we unite given our diversities? I believe this is probably something, as Mr. Al-Brahim is saying here, that is for discussion, is for within the community to come up with how that will be, how that will unfold over time. But I believe that that is something that is being looked at within the community. So I believe our time is almost up here, and unfortunately we're not able to. There are a couple more questions that one more question that we're not able to answer, but I hope that the recordings actually of this session will be up online and within the website. And the question that person has about mothers with children is actually addressed around ensuring that particularly mothers who have large number of children, that they're able to access services. That was the concern that came up within our project. We thank you all for being with us today and listening to our presentation. We hope that our reports will be read as they come out shortly. And there's more work to be done for sure. And I want to end by commenting on the fact that this project with Syrians, when they arrived, just in the aftermath, I mean, while the civil war, it continues till today. And then during their resettlement, they were hit by the pandemic that also impacted resettlement and exacerbate many of the challenges that they encountered. But there were also many strengths that they have and that they used during the pandemic. But again, more recently, this community has been impacted by a third impact, which of course is the earthquake that has recently happened in Syria and Turkey. And so this is something that we are aware of, and we send our condolences to the communities that are affected, and that many of the challenges that are being identified here continue in many ways. And so there is continued work to be done by researchers, by policymakers, by service providers in supporting Syrian communities, as well as new refugee communities that are arriving in Canada. But these issues are continuing. And so this research, even though it's been 5 years in making, it is very relevant today and going forward, and with other refugee communities. Thank you very much.